Shalom. So, as Lance says it's a draft release, but I'm not sure it's a draft. I was told that this was kind of final, and then because the bishops and stuff have already approved it, and like Eastern Orthodoxy, thank God, isn't exactly like Protestantism, where they, you know, the bishops approve something and then they expect the lay people to like respond. Although, as Lance says, let's just say this created quite the stir in the Orthodox community online. Yeah. So, yes, Shadow, you can say hi. Um, that is my cat, Shadow of Death. In case you were not aware of it, and she wanted to bomb the stream. If anybody wants to come on and discuss this, did you do a stream on the Second Vatican Council in relationship to the Jewish religion in regards to the Vatican? I've spoken about that sometimes, but I've never actually gone through. I've never actually gone through the actual documents, Nostra Aetate, but I mean, if maybe I should. Although I have to say, Geza Vermes, honestly, I mean, that man, the more I learn about him, the more I wish there was a biography of him I could read. I think his spiritual biography would have been incredibly interesting. So the link is in the description. And yes, many people lost their minds. Although when it comes down to it, like I said, apparently it's the Ortho Bros online who lost their mind because the priests and the bishops don't quite view the Jews the same way that the Ortho Bros do, and the Ortho Bros proposing branch theory. Like, this is kind of like my thing with Father Stephen and I very briefly discussed some passages on here, only in terms of things that, I mean, I can try to explain to you guys, but most of you guys wouldn't know. But let's put it this way. If the Ortho Bros knew what Paul within Judaism says, they would lose their mind. Well, they've already lost their minds. But do not mistake Ortho Bros. I mean, I kind of feel like I have to do I have to take Father Stephen's position, like explaining what he has to say, because he's an actual priest who actually teaches and who actually has influence on what Eastern Orthodoxy, the magisterium in Eastern Orthodoxy teaches. Tim says, I am first among Ortho Luke says, my wife called the cherubic hymn the Lion King part. Okay, I have not read this entire document. I have no intention of reading this entire very long document. I guess, so this is the part, is the Lion King part? No, 165. Sorry, yeah, no, page 165. I am in the wrong page, aren't I? Yeah, I meant to, yeah. So the part I mean to be at 165, there we go, is the history of the church, chapter 11. So I'm not going to do the cherubic hymn stuff. I'm going to do the history of the church stuff. which starts with the church as Israel. And frankly, when it comes to, there is a link in the description, people. Everybody's like planning it, like pretending like I don't, like the link is in the description. You can pull it up. Link in the description, link in the description. So you can pull up the document. But this, I mean, I guess the reaction, I mean, this is a rather tame document, I would say, in comparisons to what Paul within Judaism teaches. Like, if you are aware of the actual inner, like, this is why I keep on saying I think Father Stephen will be burnt at the stake as a Judaizer. Like, if this is causing, if the contents of this is causing you unrest, like, wait until you see the actual stuff that Father Stephen has his theology and his explanation. Okay, so chapter 11, the history of the church as Israel. In one sense, the Church of Christ did not come into being on the day of Pentecost. That is because the Church of Christ is the Israel of God that accepted its destiny in Christ and embraced the promises which God made to his people. I hate when they don't capitalize the H. And fulfilled through Jesus. And Israel began long before the day of Pentecost, circa 33 AD. Now, this, yes, it smacks of supersessionism, and this is, but this is not a supplanting supersessionism. That's so they believe that they have been incorporated into Israel, which for the which is what sometimes we refer to as soft supersessionism, which is what the Roman Catholic Church formally embraced in Nostra Aetate in Vatican II. So this is not hard supersessionist. This is soft supersessionist, and soft supersessionism is basically what most Christians believe. Well, okay. Hard supersessionism is what most Christians, like if you were to take a poll of the vast majority of Christians in the world and you were to ask them questions, they would assume a hard supersessionist position unless they were so ignorant that they take the hyper dispensationalist, and I'm not just talking dispensation, I'm talking hyper dispensational fundamentalist view that the actual Israel is Israel, right? Like the Israel they see on the map, they read their Bible, they're like, oh, well, that's what the Bible's talking about. The Israel that's on the map, right? The political entity of Israel that is a member of the United Nations, right? So like, you have all levels of ignorance. So let's dismiss the ignorant Christians and talk about the actual people who have beliefs that are taught within churches. The vast majority of churches that people belong to, and if they knew what their own church taught, they would know that their church is either non-supersessionist or soft supersessionist. Okay? There are some, like independent Baptist denominations out in the middle of nowhere where they still teach hard supersessionism, and all the anti-Semites on the on the internet teach hard supersessionism, of course. And for a hard supersessionist, even this kind of becomes a problem, because the hard supersessionist position, which is not in any way, like, you can't actually read Romans 9, 10, and 11 and come to the actual hard supersessionist view, because there, Paul refers to those Jews who do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah as Israel, right? So he very obviously, when Paul is talking like there in Romans 10 specifically, I think, he very, very specifically, he's like, okay, yeah, Israel didn't accept Jesus, right? So this is after the resurrection, this is after Pentecost, and I guess what they would say, I mean, these types of people can come up with all kinds of things, but okay, I'm going to have to stop actually yeah, so if you guys, I mean, if somebody wants to come on, Jacob quotes Paul as a proof text how the mighty have fallen. So if anybody wants to jump on, I can't read this text and also read the comments, but the and I have to say, Jason, I love you for spelling supersession correctly. Thank you. Just the fact that you spelled supersession with S's, there is no C in supersession. I could make a joke about that. There is no Catholic in supersession, which, yeah, hard supersessionism. Okay, back to the actual thing of supersessionism. So this, can you guys read? Let me see if I can make this a little larger. Lance. Okay, so Lance is here.
Keep yourself large and in charge. I'll handle the comments.
You'll handle the comments? Thank you, Lance. You're a good man. Okay, so we were talking hard and soft supersessionism. And so hard supersessionism says that old Israel, right, that I am no longer considered part of Israel. Christians are, but I am not, because I don't accept Jesus, right? And that is, you can try to get away with that with a very cursory reading of Romans 10. But if you actually read Romans 10, it becomes very clear that that's not what Paul is saying, right? Paul isn't saying that people like me are no longer part of Israel. He's saying we're also part of Israel. And that's a soft supersessionism that apparently online has been very, very I don't know, Lance, if you want to talk about the reaction there has been online, but you know it better than I do.
Yeah, I don't, this whole, and Luke disagrees with me, like this whole Ortho Bro phenomenon, like I found that to be mainly an online thing. Yeah. I just say for the record, I just literally 5 minutes from my house is the closest church. I'm going to Greek Orthodox Church. And I've run into I'm keeping count. I've run into at least 15 young men, new inquirers over the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I was at the Antiochian church. I met another 5 to 7, right? Mm-hmm. And some of them came in through, there were a lot of Jordan Petersons, a ton, Jonathan Pageaus, but you also have that Jay Dyer crowd or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I will just say, when they come into the church, right? When they, through that, when they come into the church, they're running into Father DeYoung. And then Father DeYoung is catechizing them. They're being brought in. They're doing, and so the church and the priest takes care of all of that kind of other stuff. And, I know it is this online phenomenon, and I don't belong to Dyer's server. Or I don't really watch any of his stuff, but I guess like there are young men like Andrew and stuff. Like I almost feel like there's this shot that's always being taken at these young male converts, and I just want to stick up for them.
Yeah, let's distinguish between Andrew and Ortho Bros. Okay, Andrew is not an Ortho Bro. Andrew is a Christian who decided to go and become a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church because of things he learned online. That's not what an Ortho Bro is.
Right.
And an Ortho Bro is somebody who decided he represents the Eastern Orthodox Church without stepping into one, Jay Dyer. And as opposed to joining the Eastern Orthodox Church, has decided that they are representatives of the Eastern Orthodox Church, even though they never walked.
I totally get the Ortho Bro phenomenon, but I guess maybe I don't hang out probably in the online circles where I see that a lot. And I really cultivated my Twitter feed to get rid of certain things. And so I guess I don't see it a lot. I just know the young men that I see showing up, like I don't see that. And a lot of people will tag them like that. So I just stand for them a little bit. I love this that you're jumping into this. I don't want to take you away from what you're talking about.
Well, okay. So one last comment about the Ortho Bros. I encounter Ortho Bros because they are LARPing. They are LARPing as Eastern Orthodox Christians, and they're not actual members of the Eastern Orthodox faith, but generally. They also tend to LARP as former Jews who converted. And that it becomes really, really hilarious and weird, especially when there's become a cottage industry. Like I follow a particular Twitter account that's all he does is expose people who pretend to have grown up in an Orthodox Jewish family and are now Orthodox Christians. And it takes a lot of research, but he exposes the fact that they're just lying. Okay? Yeah. So
I would say, taking it out of the Ortho Bro realm, what I think one of the issues does come up is that Orthodoxy is a much bigger tent than people realize. Mm-hmm. That, you can even look at saints and they'll say kind of the opposite things sometimes, and so I think a lot of people get a little nervous that someone like that. One of the things I saw, which was not an Ortho Bro thing that I would say would be a thing, is like putting out the essential beliefs in a little 200-page document is kind of like almost like not orthodox in some ways. You know what I mean? It's because it's how can you encapsulate and so on and so forth.
They have to catechize.
Exactly. My whole thing is like, listen, some of us are nerds and we will start reading the saints and the fathers and do all that stuff. And other people have jobs and lives and they just want to participate in a church and they're not going to go down the rabbit hole. So in defense of the OCA, I understand why you would put this document together.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see why are you complaining that your church is actually trying to teach their gospel? But Dan explains LARP is live action role-playing game. And as Andrew so beautifully put it, LARP me as I LARP Christ, St. Paul. Okay, let's get back to...
Well, and you'll like this, and there are some folks of a more ethnic bent that really love that it's the Church of America putting out some of the, that stuff comes into it too.
Oh, so they claim, now this is an Americanizing. Yeah, I can imagine. Look, I'll go back to my thing. I think if I am predicting that when people actually find out what Father Stephen believes, because they'll actually believe that he means what he says, because I have had so many people try to convince me that Father Stephen does not actually mean the things that he said. And it's just so hilarious to me. I do think he will eventually end up being burnt at the stake as a Judaizer, and God should accept his holy sacrifice as a martyr. Okay. So, and Israel began long before the day of Pentecost, circa 31 AD. This will already trigger hard supersessionists, because they will say, no, before 33 AD, there was a different Israel, which now ceases to be Israel. And the soft supersessionist position, which again, Romans 10, you have to believe that, no, God actually founded Israel. I mean, they later say that God founded Israel with Abraham, which I take issue with, because God founded Israel at Sinai. And because guess what? Israel is a name for Jacob, and Jacob was born, was the grandson of Abraham. So that history doesn't work for me, but it is what Paul, I would say, is probably, I mean, that's how Father Stephen, and I think everybody, like most actual Orthodox priests who've thought about it, view it. Okay, so God had promised to bless Israel, and after their return from exile, to bring the Messiah and to establish his kingdom on earth. The church of the first century was that portion of Israel, again, triggering people, which believed in Jesus, and through which God fulfilled his promise to bless and glorify his people. More capitalization, please. It constituted the faithful remnant, the true Israel. I would say actually the faithful remnant were the ones who rejected Jesus, but I'm Jewish, I'm not Christian. I expect a Christian to say the other one. I will also point out that faithful remnant, a remnant is usually much, much smaller than the whole. And yeah, that's one of the things that in Jewish theology we have always said, is that Israel as the people of God will always be a small nation among the greater, of course, all people belong to God, because Lashem Ha'olam Umlo'o, the entirety of the world and everything that is in it belongs to God, but Israel is a particular small portion that is chalek nachalato, the portion of his inheritance, as it says in Deuteronomy, I believe it is. And I would say the fact that the church is actually so big, in fact, but I guess if you're Eastern Orthodox, you might believe that, you know, like, we're the faithful remnant, and most Christians don't actually know what they're doing. But now that actually, like, that's a whole, like, you're aligning yourself more with the Jews and less with the Catholics and the Western Protestants. If you're saying that, that's a whole other thing. If you, anytime you want to jump in, feel free to jump in, Lance. You too, Andrew, but what do you know? You're not even a deacon. The history of the church, therefore, properly begins with the call of Abraham and God's promise. Okay, I mean, they're saying the history of the church, the history of the faith of Abraham, yes, I would say, begins with the call to Abraham, Israel, and I mean, this is part of Jewish belief, is that Islam are the children of Ishmael, and Christianity is the children of Esav, and we are Israel, the children of Jacob. And God's promise to him that through his family, all the nations of the world would be blessed. Correct. All the nations of the world would be blessed. He is the father of all believers. It was on the day of Pentecost that Israel began to be glorified by him and began its work of blessing all the world's nations. I would say, no, that's not, that happened at Sinai, not at Pentecost. Pentecost is a celebration and commemoration of Sinai.
Jacob, I too agree. The fact that they don't capitalize him and he and all this stuff in here is driving me crazy.
Thank you.
What?
Thank you.
Who are they signed off on this document? Come on.
I'm pretty sure it's been signed off on. Yeah. Okay. Okay. The identity of the church with true Israel is sometimes obscured by the overwhelming predominance of Gentiles within the church. And again, so this is part of the Paul and Judaism stuff that will trigger a lot of people who think they are Christians but don't know very much about it, because they think of themselves as no longer Gentiles. So they think the word Gentile refers to non-believers. And actually, I mean, most Christianity, certainly not. I mean, unless you're hard supersessionist, you don't believe that, like, hard supersessionism is before Jesus, there was Israel and Gentiles. Jesus came and the two switch, right? The who was Israel before became the Gentiles, and who was Gentiles became the Jews, right? Became Israel. That is not what this is teaching, and that's going to trigger people who don't know their Christian theology very well. One that therefore hears of the so-called supersessionist theology, which teaches that the Gentiles in the church have replaced Jewish Israel as the people of God. It is true that because of the hard hearts of many in the synagogue, Paul said that he was turning to the Gentiles, Acts 13:46. And it is true that the law fulfilled its divinely appointed role as a pedagogue to lead Israel to Christ. Well, it obviously didn't fulfill it if Israel didn't come to Christ, I have to say. And that Judaism as a religion was therefore now obsolete. Again, I like...
Well, I would say there were quite a few Jewish people that did come to Christ. Others didn't.
Obviously, the largest portion did not, and Judaism. I mean, this is like, Judaism is still here, and yeah. So, like, the idea that Judaism as a religion was therefore now obsolete. Yeah, I would ask a believing Christian to look around the world, pray to God to open his eyes, and see if that's what he believes is true. Okay.
I was just fortunate that I was not raised around, nor was supersessionist theologies part of my natural understanding. So this doesn't offend me.
Okay, glad to hear. Severian, haven't seen you in a long time. How you doing? Okay. Where were we? Yet even after Paul turned away from the hard-hearted Jews of Pisidian Antioch, he continued to preach the gospel to other Jews in their synagogues, offering the gospel to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Romans 1:16. And Israel as a people still had a fundamental role to play as God's true vine. Ooh, this must have made people angry. Whose final conversion would signal the end of the age and the resurrection of the dead. Romans 11:17 through 21:15. And I have to say, like, I point, like, these silly people to Romans 10 and 11 left and right, and this must be, like, yeah, quite a stir among people who don't know their religion as well as this Jew does. Whatever. Paul's teaching is clear. The church has not replaced Israel. Ooh, The church is Israel, the faithful remnant in whom the messianic promises for blessing Israel would be fulfilled.
Now you do have to understand. Do have to understand why Protestants, when you start making the hard move that they make in the year 500 away from everything, which would be, having the liturgies or the things that that look more, let's just say, Jewish in some ways. I know you would do, but it is, right?
Yeah.
And that's why you can have this church that is so disconnected from the way that worship and liturgical prayer and all the things that happen even today for you with the Shema and everything else, and what happened within Orthodoxy. Also, the daily, like, we keep the same sort of hours and the hourly prayers, and the day begins at sunset, and all these other things that are continued on. That stuff was all a hard break at the Reformation. And so I think some of this stuff starts coming in, but I think it is when you start having kind of these novel ideas. I shouldn't try to be offensive. You probably don't, but that doesn't bother you, does it, Jacob? But when you have this break, I mean, it's almost a natural outcrop of when you throw the baby out with the bathwater and you start anew with everything. Then you come up with theories like this, like supersessionism and stuff like that.
So Clint says, Jacob, your comments about a remnant being small earlier bolster the claim in this reading where the majority did not follow Jesus. Yeah, but that was for, like, a majority of Israel did not follow Jesus into a Gentile church that is now the largest religion in the world. I don't know if we can call this the new catechism, but it is the new document through which they are going to be teaching adults. And there is a link in the description for people who want to follow along. Hello, Guy. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Yeah, been so busy. I'm going to be massively busy next. I work in a sports organisation. We're coming up to our moment.
I see. Did you have anything you wanted to contribute?
It was quite interesting. I mean, I'm not totally sure the Orthodox belief, to be honest. But it's interesting because I go to a church that is very supportive of Israel in a classic North American sense, which is really unusual for the UK. But I actually think that what they're saying here, that the church is Israel, is quite an interesting proposition. And for me, one of the things I always say is that we understand that about a quarter to a half of all Jews in the New Testament period converted, if that's the right word, and from into becoming, or migrated into becoming Christians. And therefore, what's interesting.
Before 70, I don't know if that's true before 70.
No, I don't think it's before 70, but I think before the persecution of Jews in the church starts around 300.
Well, yeah. I mean, again,
so over a long, because Paul's aim is aiming at Christians, Jews. So
this is difficult.
This is very impossible to know.
This is very difficult history, and what you Father Stephen is not a member of the OCA, but he is quite influential, and I don't believe I'm revealing anything when I say that he was certainly consulted when this was written. But because he is such a prominent member of Eastern Orthodoxy regarding the history of the church, and his books are so popular. But
so he did come in because he wasn't given any credit, and then also he's an Antiochian.
No, he did. He was not officially involved, but he. Let's put it this way: the people who wrote it are people who very clearly consulted him. And so.
But the corollary of what I just said is that the people who are today still consider themselves Jewish.
Right.
Sorry, I shouldn't put air quotes around. You consider yourself Jewish. Those are the people who chose not to accept Jesus.
Yes.
in that period, and the
Well,
descendants thereof.
right, and part of my argument with Father Stephen has in fact been that because this view, which is actually very in keeping with Eastern Orthodox ideas of like the belief that the Great Commission, right, is like you have different ethne. And so there's this idea of the church as the house of Abraham, and they call it Israel, right? Commonwealth of Israel, I guess they're using here. It would still includes various ethne, one of which is the natural vine of Israel, right? Which would be my family, right? Like my family still speaks Aramaic, right? My family's been living in probably, I mean, as far as we can tell, my family's been living in the hills of Babylon, like on the rivers of Babylon since the Babylonian captivity. Like my family are the bad Jews who didn't go back with Ezra to Israel, right? Like we get called out. We get called out in the book of Ezra, not by Paul, right? And so this is saying, oh no, Jacob's family doesn't suddenly become accursed of God and da 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 da, which is what a lot of supersessionists want to understand the teaching to be. And I mean, clearly setting this out is obviously triggering some people. Okay. So where were we? Paul's teachings is clear. The church has not replaced Israel. The church is Israel, the faithful remnant in whom the messianic promises for blessing Israel would be fulfilled. The cross and resurrection of Christ have radically reconfigured and redefined membership in God's people. Formerly, membership in Israel was expressed through circumcision and keeping the Mosaic laws. Now it is expressed through baptism and discipleship to Jesus. This is why Paul called the church the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16 and the Commonwealth of Israel in Ephesians 2:12. This is the reason that St. John, or rather the Lord speaking through John as prophet, declared that those in the synagogue of Smyrna who were persecuting the church there were lying when they said that they were Jews. Revelation 2:9. The true Jews and members of Israel were the Christians, whether they came from Jewish or Gentile parents. Obviously, I disagree with this. The quarrel of the church with the synagogue was therefore an in-house Jewish quarrel, a disagreement over what now constituted membership in Israel after the death and glorification of Jesus the Messiah. The apostles' contention was that the Jews which rejected Christ thereby forfeited their right to be called true Jews or to be considered a part of his people. Citation needed. The death of Jesus as a Messiah, which I would say kind of says he's not the Messiah, radically changed everything. Citation needed. Relativizing the law, heaven forbid, relativizing the law. Oof. Bad wording. I please tell me you don't believe that the law of God can be relativized and reconfiguring Israel's destiny. Yeah. The glory that was promised by the prophets had indeed come from Jesus, but that glory was not to be realized nationally. Well, it doesn't appear to be realized at all. Second coming, preterism, like, come on. Israel was not to be glorified as a nation. Yeah, apparently not. But rather as a transnational people in the glorified Messiah. Again, I don't see the glorification here. The martyric church if the first Christians imagined that the fulfillment of God's promises to bless his people and glorify them in the world meant that they would experience no opposition, they were soon taught otherwise. The Lord himself warned them of this, saying, if they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. John 15:20. And the persecution which engulfed the infant church after the day of Pentecost abundantly fulfilled his words. Acts 4:5 through 31, 5:17 through 39, 8:3. I have to say this. No, at first, the persecution did not come from the Jews. At first, the persecution came from the Romans. And anybody who actually knows the history of Christianity, the actual history, not what the Christian Bible says, knows that the Jews were in no position to persecute anyone. They were the persecuted. And actually look up what happened in 70 and in 120, the first and second Jewish wars. Look up what Josephus says. That is not a picture of people capable of persecuting anyone. They were being subjugated. And this is why people who actually know their history pretty much have reinterpreted what how the Gospels are understood in ways, Gospels, Acts, and, well, actually, I don't know if the authentic letters of Paul, because they're actually, again, they're not pointing to the letters of Paul, they're pointing to Acts to say that the Jews persecuted the Christians.
Yeah, because immediately when they were out preaching the crucified Christ, they were brought in front of the Sanhedrin and everything else. So,
but the Sanhedrin was a puppet state.
Okay, so whatever. But there were persecutions that were being had. I mean, you could sit there and to say that you have to be part of the ruling class.
Mm-hmm.
To be a persecutor, you can persecute people in your little smaller. So to act as if only the king can persecute and that a local community couldn't persecute. Like I get what you're saying. I'm not arguing with that. Yeah.
No, they could. Like what Acts 7 portrays, if Acts 7 is actually that portrays a mob of Jews killing Stephen for being Christian. I think that when you look at the actual situation, you see that wasn't that the best way you can reconcile and I've said this many times before, the best way you can reconcile the story that the Christian Bible tells with the actual history, which someone who knows the history of the time would agree with, is to say, have you heard about what I call the samizdat theory? The idea that the Gospels and Acts were written in such a way so that they could be distributed among the Christian community, which was being persecuted by the Romans, without the Romans realizing they were saying what they were saying, which was
That's 100%. That's actually 100%, because you see Paul alluding to the mysteries, and a lot of the stuff that a Protestant would say, well, I don't see that in the Bible. It's like, well, first off, they were speaking in code and everything else, and that was not to hide from the Jews. That was to hide from the Romans. You are absolutely correct. Like they said very shortly thereafter, right? So that's what would happen. And we still use that today in our liturgy, like the confessional prayer right before the Eucharist has happened. He says, we will not betray your mysteries nor give you a kiss as did Judas. And so the stuff that they were going, and
so there is this idea that they were writing in code, and therefore a lot of times when they talked about persecution by Jews or things like that, they were actually understood by the people who were reading at the time as, oh, well, obviously this was they're actually. So the idea that Caiaphas would become a saint, right? I think would be so incredibly just ridiculous to most Christians, that the fact that he is in fact celebrated as a saint by some churches is kind of like, really? Are you really? You know?
I think the natural normal understanding is, would this have caused problems with rabbis in synagogues if you were coming here preaching a crucified Christ? In certain ones, absolutely, right? If you were going to try and talk about this in the temple, would that have been, hey, he's the Son of God, he was crucified? Of course, that wouldn't have been accepted by the Jewish leaders, of the day.
But Acts 5 quite clearly says that when they came and they were preaching, they weren't preaching Jesus as God. They were preaching Jesus as the Messiah. And as Acts 5 testifies, the response of Gamaliel, who was the leader, and
right, I was going to go there.
Yeah,
is let him be, because
let him be.
If it's of God, it's of God. It will go. It'll
exactly
last. If not, it'll go away. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. This assertion that the letter of Acts is in a code and not an orderly account, as the greeting explicitly states, got to prove that out. As far as I'm concerned, you have two choices. It's either flat out lying or in code. You could believe that it's an orderly account of the history, but I think it is so close to being the opposite of what we know the history to be, that it makes more sense to say it is in code exaggerations so that people know you're being sarcastic, than to say that it is an actual factual.
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. For us, the difficulty is trying to figure out what that both and is in the year 2023, right?
Yeah.
That's why you yourself, the Bible and the Holy Spirit's a really dangerous thing. Like you probably want to hang on to, like, Hezi talks about the sages and stuff. There might be some wisdom in trying to be closer to the people that were closer to the times, right?
Look, and frankly, I think the churches which retained a history did a much better job of actually remembering what life under the Roman Church was, what a Roman government was like, and duly understanding what was going on, as opposed to the people who read it literally. So Jason asks, why couldn't Caiaphas become a saint? I have to say, like, this is part of my beef with Paul, is there is a concept in Pauline Christianity that a repentant sinner can go to the front of the line, can go to the front of the thing. And in Judaism, a repentant sinner goes to the back of the line. We're glad you repented. Now you go back to the back of the line and you work. It's possible that after many, many years, you may in fact prove, but we don't know your heart. Repentance is something that God gets to choose. And it's possible that you are completely repentant and God sees that, but that's not something that we see. And therefore, a repentant sinner in Judaism goes to the back of the line, not the front of the line. Whereas I believe in a lot of Christianity, especially with regard to the history of Paul, the repentant sinner somehow goes to the front of the line, and that just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
I still think you're talking majority Protestant, but hey,
what?
Because that's what Luther does, right?
Okay, but isn't that what Paul himself did, though? He suddenly starts making fun of the super apostles, who are all of the people who actually lived with Jesus, were brothers of Jesus, knew Jesus, were leading a church that he was then persecuting supposedly, and then he flips over and suddenly now he's the chief of the apostles according to some people. And Father Stephen says to me he doesn't believe that's what happened at all, actually.
Mhm.
And
and also Paul spent 13, like in Acts, Paul disappears. Like there was 13 years that it's called his Tarsus time or whatever. Like once he had this experience, he's not on the map for a while, right? And that was that time where, again, he talks about where he was taken up and he spent that time. So no, in the earliest formations, there's
Right.
a big break between Paul's road to Damascus moment and then actually getting out and going on the travels that he went on.
Well, I mean, this is in fact, and this is how Father Stephen portrays it, and how I have seen. I now see Christians portraying it, but I grew up in the Protestant milieu, where in the Protestant milieu, that idea of formation and taking years, as opposed to hallelujah, I have the Holy Spirit, let me jump on stage and like in a Catholic or Orthodox church, right? If the Holy Spirit moves you, you don't go and jump into the baptistry and then go in front and give a homily. Whereas I think in some Protestant churches that's considered kind of like the best thing you could possibly do, you know? Guy, do you have any comments?
I'm sorry, I'm distracted.
Oh, okay. I
It
thought.
turns out that a meeting I was at is on main national news.
Oh, okay. So
I'm going to disappear. I've got
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm really.
Plus,
No problem.
let's don't get like the elephant in the room is there's the whole Peter and Paul thing, and then the Peter is the seat of Rome, and so you have all
Can I
that
just throw
sort of
another one
stuff.
in before we do that? So,
Sure.
the lady caught in adultery
Right.
is about to be stoned. That's in the time of Jesus. Stephen is stoned. That's post-Jesus, post-crucifixion, in the beginning of the church. But what's interesting is that Jesus cannot be stoned. Jesus has to be crucified. And to do that, so there's two judicial killings, one before and one after the crucifixion. The crucifixion itself has to go to Pilate and has to be done by the Romans. Just an interesting thought. As you were talking about it, why is it that the Jews could execute the two people either side, but not the man in the middle, so to speak? I'm going to dump that one on you and leave you, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Nice.
Talk to you later, Guy. Thank you for
Yeah.
joining. I do want to highlight this thing from the sample. I've been attending an Orthodox church for almost 3 years now. Never met an Ortho Bro in the wild. Yes, Ortho Bros are LARPers online. They are not people who actually show up on churches. We have a lot of converts, no Ortho Bros. I have to say, I do not want to in any way impugn actual Christians as Ortho Bros. Let us distinguish between Christians and Ortho Bros.
I think that's a good distinction, because when I speak about that, I'm speaking about it of the young men I meet in actual churches. So I guess that would be it.
Look.
One of the things I take back in terms of the Peter and Paul stuff, like we also have to peel back and just look at the context of it.
Yeah.
There's that whole Peter is of Rome, and then also from a Protestant perspective, here you had Paul, who wasn't with Jesus, right? And then and then also, there becomes all this weird stuff between Peter and Paul that kind of people get into, right? And that's why, like a lot of, like when you see Orthodox churches, you'll have Saints Peter and Paul, because what they want to show is the fullness of it, right? It's not this separation.
I wish I could recommend James, the Brother of Jesus by Robert Eisenman, but it's a really long book that blabs a lot. But yeah, and okay, so I have to say again, like once you've gone through a year of catechism before you've been baptized, you're already not an Ortho Bro, right? An Ortho Bro does not have a year of being catechized. That just does not, those two are mutually exclusive. Okay. Okay. So, I only have another hour, and I'm afraid this might take much longer. But let's. How far have we gone?
We'll let you
We're on
read
the first
along.
page.
We won't
Okay.
interrupt.
If the first Christians, as first the persecution came from the Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Romans functioned as rescuers of the church Christians. But soon enough, the Romans themselves also turned against the Christians. No, it wasn't soon enough. Like, this is completely bogus history. I'm sorry. And the church found itself under threat from all sides. The first fierce persecution from the Romans came at the hands of the Emperor Nero. After the Great Fire in Rome in the 6th decade of the first century, the Christians were commonly thought by Roman society at large to be polluted wretches, and because they were considered Jews, and thus were. And I mean, they apparently don't talk about the expulsion of the Jews from Rome, the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem, the fleeing of the early Christians, including Jesus's brother and the other Christians from Jerusalem, from the Romans, along with the other Jews. And thus were an obvious target as Nero arrested and killed Christians in the area around Rome. A persecution which claimed the lives of Peter and Paul. Don't know about that. Soon enough, however, I am not aware of anything that actually says that Nero persecuted Peter and Paul as part of that. I believe there's a letter about them being killed individually, but I don't know that history, how they get that history, but okay. Soon enough, however, the scope of the persecution widened, and Christians throughout the entire empire were in danger. They were universally hated and subject to legislation outlawing their assemblies and threatening their very existence. The persecution heated up so that by the time of the Emperor Diocletian, at the end of the first century, Christians began to live under threat of arrest, exile, or worse. The reasons for the halo of hatred around the Church of God were many and varied. The whole of society, education, and culture in the Roman world were built upon the foundation of the worship of the pagan gods, a worship which affected everything, including such everyday things such as the meat sold in the markets. See 1 Corinthians 8-10. Again, I have to say, they are not talking about the well-known history of the persecution by the Romans of the Jews, and the fact that many Christians were affected because they were Jewish, or they were affiliated or believed to be a sect of Judaism, were affected by that persecution of Jews as Jews, which also explains why so many Christian churches ended up leaderless and with Gentile leaders, the early leaders, including the Bishop of Jerusalem, and actually talk about what happened to the Bishop of Jerusalem, who was Jesus's brother, who was forced to flee, and they're not doing any of that. Christians would have nothing to do with such idolatry and refused to eat the food set before them if they knew it had been offered to idols. And so again, the Jewish Christians were exempt from that because they were Jews, but the Gentile Christians were not, and that was a cause of Gentile Christians wanting to become part of the Jewish community, and that caused all kinds of dynamics as well, because then you had Gentile Christians who were being persecuted as a wild sect of Judaism by people who hated Jews and did not even have the protection of being part of the Jewish community, which caused all kinds of tensions between the Christians and the Jews as people mutually being persecuted by Romans, especially during the Jewish wars. This meant that their daily existence was dramatically impacted by their faith, and they soon had a reputation as a group that hated their neighbors and the society around them, including the Jews. Furthermore, the comparative secrecy of their assemblies helped perpetuate misunderstandings and further contributed to their bad reputation. Talk about eating the body and drinking the blood, receiving the Eucharist, and about Jesus being the Pais Theo, the child servant of God, led to the misunderstanding that the church was engaging in cannibalizing infants, which later was used against Jews. Talk about the brothers and sisters exchanging the kiss of peace, led to the accusations that the church engaged in incest or at least orgies. No wonder the Christians in those days were hated. The Christians in those days were often hated for being Jews. The persecution of the church was sporadic but sustained. The laws decreed that Christians were not allowed to exist, but the enforcement of the laws depended upon circumstances, the mood of the mob, and the clemency of the local rulers. This is very correct. But whether Christians were arrested, tortured, killed, or not, the threat of such things always hung over their heads. The church of the first 300 years was a martyric church, a church in which baptism and attendance at the Eucharist could lead to exile, torture, or death. Many, in fact, did suffer the ultimate penalty for their faith, and the church from the start honored them as the truest of disciples, the athletes, and the heroes of Christ, the confessors who continue to confess their faith even under torture, and the martyrs who died for Christ were held in the highest honor. The stories of the martyrs were recited and shared, and the anniversaries of their martyrdom, called their birthdays, since they were born above in heaven on that day, were commemorated every year, if possible, by serving the Eucharist above their tombs. After Pascha, the feasts of the martyrs were the earliest commemorations on the church's developing calendar. As a response to such persecutions, a number of Christians undertook the task of writing to defend the church, denying the church's charges that Christians were doing anything wrong or criminal, and explaining how the worship of the Christian God was reasonable and good, and further explaining why the Christians refused to worship the traditional gods of the pagans. Also explaining why Christians shouldn't just become Jews. Also explaining why Jews who had become Christians shouldn't just give up being Christians and go back to being Jews. These men were known as the apologists, since they offered an apologia, or defense of the faith. Justin, thank God for they didn't call him saint, writing and teaching in Rome, offered two different defenses of Christianity, as well as an explanation in his dialogue with Trypho of why Christianity was preferable to Judaism, the other major non-pagan form of monotheism in the Roman Empire that was seeking converts. No, Judaism was not seeking converts. Judaism does not seek converts. Judaism is opposed to seeking converts. Justin was martyred for his faith in 165 AD. Maybe, I don't know about that. Another Christian who aggressively defended the faith was Tertullian, writing from North Africa somewhat later. As well as threats from outside the church, the faith was threatened by error from within. This includes threats from some Christians whose explanations of Christianity distorted the scriptures and incorporated the church's proclamation of Jesus into alien systems of thought. Those teaching these distortions were many and varied, and usually are known under the general term Gnostics. those with special and secret gnosis or knowledge. What almost all the Gnostic systems had in common was a rejection of the goodness of the created world, or a rejection of the creator God of the Old Testament as the one true God. And I kind of wish they would name Marcionism here so that Christians would know that what that is as a heresy. Christians like Irenaeus, teaching in Lyon, outlined the various competing Gnostic systems and argued against them in his massive work against heresies. Irenaeus focused upon the apostolic tradition of teaching that could be found in all the major episcopal centers, such as Rome, as the standard, condensing that teaching into a canon or rule of faith. He died in the year 202. The first 3 centuries were times of immense conflict as the church battled enemies without and within. There were also times of growth as the numbers of Christians increased dramatically despite the persecutions. Some would say because of the persecutions, because the pen is mightier than the sword, and the best way of proving that someone that you have no way of refuting what someone is saying is by using violence against them, which will often make people go, hey, maybe that guy had something worth believing.
Well, Irenaeus, by the way, he was martyred. He was
Okay.
martyred. So, and Father John Bear talks about him a lot. He spent a ton of time studying Irenaeus as he was writing his stuff. So there's lots of stuff out there and talking about that. But one of the things that he wrote to the other Christians is don't try and stop this martyrdom, because he wanted this to happen. And so I would say, I would point out to you, this is being written to Christians, so it's not to give the Jewish history, so we don't put all the Jewish history in there. And those martyrs, like from the early church, they absolutely were starting to meet and do Eucharist actually at the grave sites, right? Because they didn't have buildings or whatever. And so that there were actual stories. And so we can see Irenaeus, you have these close lineages, and he would have been either, I should know this, but he was either, I think Polycarp would have been who was one of John's disciples. He was trained by Polycarp. So you do have Christians boldly proclaiming Christ being martyred by Romans, not just because they were Jewish. I mean, they were clearly Christian. They wouldn't deny it. So
no.
But I would just say it's both and. It's not either.
Yeah.
Way.
No. And so Lance confusing Irenaeus and Ignatius. No evidence Irenaeus was murdered. Sorry to be fact checking again, Joe. Thank you very much.
He said now that's in dispute. I will. Let's go back to this.
Okay. I don't want to go there.
No, we'll go. Sam, we'll talk about this, but Father John Bear talks about that a lot in a lot of his things. So Sam and I will come back to that.
So the no. It is very clear that Christians were being persecuted more than the general Jew, and that was one of the reasons why the church fathers spoke so harshly about Judaism. Was there were Christians who were leaving Christianity to become Jews, because life as a Jew was easier than life as a Christian. And so the early church fathers had a lot of reason to be like, no, like, don't flee the church to go become a Jew in order to escape Roman persecution. And I think a lot of people they don't know that context of what the church fathers are saying. Okay. So that Tertullian observed that the blood of the martyred Christians functioned like seed for growth. The growth was most dramatic in the cities. The Christians were everywhere and were impossible to ignore. At the beginning of the 4th century, a determined attempt was made by the emperor to eliminate them from the life of the empire. In a long persecution stretching over a decade, it was the climax and culmination of a long struggle. The Peace of Constantine. Since it was the emperor's task as Pontifex Maximus to preside over the state's devoted worship of the gods. It was thought by all the Christians, even part of the imperially sponsored persecutions, apart from the imperial persecutions, that the office of emperor was incompatible with the practice of the Christian faith, and that a Christian emperor was an impossibility, a contradiction in terms. That is why Constantine appeared to the Christians like a thunderclap coming from a clear and cloudless sky. Whether converted to Christ earlier in life or shortly before entering Rome in triumph in 312, it soon became clear that Emperor Constantine believed in the Christian God and intended to favor the church. He confirmed the cessation of persecution and allowed the properties of the church to be returned. He and his immediate dynasty championed the Christian cause, even calling the bishops to Nicaea to sort out the confusion caused by the teaching of Arius, and promising to back the official teaching of the church with government support. And I have to say, like, in my view of the Great Apostasy, in my view of what happened, I believe that Nicaea and Constantine constitutes when Christianity went off the path of Jesus into what I say is, at Nicaea, the church turned its back on God, Israel, and Jesus. Obviously, I don't expect Christians to agree with that. With Constantine as emperor, a new day dawned for the church. Christians at the time wondered whether their new good fortune wasn't perhaps too good to last, and with the accession of Julian as emperor, it seemed as if their prosperity under Constantine and his sons was indeed just a passing phase. Emperor Julian detested the Christians and was determined to turn back the cultural clock and restore the unquestioned ascendancy of the old pagan religion. His sudden death on the field of battle in 363, after a reign of only 20 months, brought his pagan agenda to a decisive end. All subsequent emperors would be Christian. The Roman Empire was now officially under the heavenly protection of Christ, who ruled through the might of his chosen servant, the emperor. As the church rapidly grew in importance, government involved in church affairs also grew apace. The government's determination to use force to root out heresy and enforce an imperially backed orthodoxy was to have both positive and negative effect, including Christians persecuting Jews now, especially when the bishops did not actually profess the Orthodox faith. For good or for ill or both, the church would experience government involvement in almost every aspect of its life. The emperor was heavily involved in the selection of bishops, and as government facilitated wealth poured into the church, bishops became very competitive, with rich and important men jockeying for important episcopal positions, and those important bishops striving to gain ever more power and influence. And I have to say, this is something that often comes at huge shock to people who are coming from outside of Eastern Orthodox churches into Eastern Orthodox churches, is that people who grow up Eastern Orthodox oftentimes will expect high-level church officials to be horrible people, because who are there for power and for the wrong reasons. They love their local priests because they know that their priests are not the type of people that the leaders, the political leaders, and the wealthy in their communities will elevate, because the more faithful of an actual person you are, the less likely you are to have some dictator like Putin allow you to rise to the point of being a bishop or certainly patriarch, because basically killing patriarchs that aren't doing exactly as they're told is kind of a normal sport in many of the countries in which Eastern Orthodoxy operates. And even in those places where they're not killed, there is definitely a lot of influence by the corrupt in making sure who the leader is. And so don't be very surprised when, for example, the ecumenical patriarch may be the most hated figure in all of Eastern Orthodoxy, including by your standard run-of-the-mill priest, because they're like the really, really good. The general consensus I have encountered personally among people who are cradle Eastern Orthodox is my local pastor or my local monastic, my local saintly nun or monk or priest or deacon or whoever it is too Christian to rise in the ranks. And that's because of the influence of the government into these churches. And the people who live in these churches, who are involved in these churches, realize that. And the church has persevered despite the bad leadership, not because like very, very saintly people have been able to rule from above necessarily. So, yeah. From being the targeted leaders of a hunted and persecuted sect, bishops came to be the controllers of wealth and power. The situation was not conducive to finding the best men as leaders, as the good leaders among the bishops recognized and often lamented. But for all the drawbacks of official government support, the church under a cooperative Roman state was able to do much good. In particular, such support helped to facilitate the church's aggressive evangelism, and in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, many people came to faith in Christ, abandoning their idols and worshiping the one true God. I think that's a process that has yet to be completed. That included a mission to the northern peoples of the Rus at the end of the 10th century through the missionary labors of such men as Cyril and Methodius. The church during these centuries flourished. Great and beautiful cathedrals were built and adorned with icons and mosaics, and there was an explosion of hymnography. The Christians abundantly proved themselves capable of producing a culture and an aesthetic as fine and even finer than pagan Roman aristocrats produced before Hellenism became Christianized. It was during this time that the church held long and fruitful and often heated debates about the exact nature of Christ. Was he truly God, or in the same sense as the Father was God, or was he only like God? And was he truly as human as we are? And how should one understand the union in him of the divine and the human? These questions were examined and argued over in a series of councils from the 4th to 8th centuries. If my cat shuts off my computer, I may have to be back, but she does that every once in a while. I haven't figured out how to make that switch.
Your cat's trying to get you to stop reading all this Christian stuff, Jacob.
Apparently, she goes up on top of the computer where the switch is and steps on the switch, and it just shuts off. The councils, whose results were finally accepted by the majority of the church throughout the world, were called ecumenical councils, and these set the standard for doctrinal orthodoxy ever after. The most significant product of the first ecumenical council was the Nicene Creed, which contained the essentials of the Orthodox faith, including the belief about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and the Church. And like I said, I think that's where the Church went wrong. All of the ecumenical councils were held in the East. The results of the council's findings had the force of law through imperial support, which further explains to me why the Church is not the Church. Dissent from these findings was heresy and was disallowed in a Christian state. Again, further proof to me that where Christianity had gone wrong, wherein the Church and secular worlds had become fused. These centuries also saw the rise, flourishing, and eventual triumph of monasticism. Thoughtful men and women with money and leisure often went on a prayerful retreat in solitude on their properties, removed from the bustle of the town. In the 4th century, beginning most prominently with Saint Anthony, Christians in Egypt went further out into the desert, so that the desert became a veritable city, populated by those who sought God in solitude and who pushed the boundaries of their earthly limitations, which is one of the reasons I want to start some form of monastery for this little corner. In places such as Constantinople.
Okay, stop
Yeah.
right there. Stop it. You can't just throw that out and not. What's this BOM or this little corner monastery going to look like?
Okay, so my hope once I graduate which is like in a year and a half, and after I do my 2 years, so that I am licensed, is to start a rehab center, which is not going to be like traditional rehab. It's actually going to be a retreat, hopefully near some monasteries. It's going to be Noachide Beit Midrash. I'll explain that later. But as a Noachide Beit Midrash near, hopefully, some monasteries, it will have healthy people living there and coming to vacation there, and it will function as a detox and rehab for individuals in community. Like, I want a 1:12 ratio at least. People in rehab versus people who are either monks or living there or visiting, in order to have so that's my vision for a Noachide rehab / monastery.
And when you say rehab, so when you say rehab from everything, specific things?
Well, I mean, drugs and alcohol are probably a big part of it, but frankly, I think a lot of people might also just need spiritual rehabilitation from all kinds of mental health issues. And so that's part of my thing of actually having it be a mental health center that is a union of spiritual health and mental health and physical health in a retreat that is going to be it's going to be for addicts of online community.
Exactly.
There you go. Yes.
I'll come live in your commune, Jacob.
This is my long-term hope. If anybody wants to contribute to that, the Joyful Mother of Children Foundation is going to be open for business soon, and I look forward to huge donations. So, like, if anybody wants, like, for $1 million, I could easily create a rehab from Trinitarian Christianity. Yes. Okay. I have to say, I've been looking at a particular very famous very, very, very famous supposed suicide hotline. And
my stepdaughter is a manager for the National Suicide. So when you were talking about that, how they were training people, like, yeah, I'm very familiar.
Okay, well, this particular organization, their yearly budget is $30 million. Sorry, $30 million. They spent less than $300,000 on actual qualified mental health professionals.
Yeah. To be fair, my stepdaughter graduated with a master's in psychology and behavioral health issues and stuff like that. So she's very well trained and was deciding whether she wants to go get her doctorate or not. So,
okay, so Tim, my hope is actually that we would have people living there full time who work remotely in all kinds of jobs. So, like, actually have families, actually have like a real community that was a faithful community, and they don't have to live at the rehab, right? So Tim, so I went and visited the monastery in there's a monastery not too far from Fresno. Here, it's actually a convent, but they call it.
So you're gonna keep it in California?
I might not, but I might also. But like honestly, I really I actually talked to one of the sisters about it. Like the idea of being close enough to an actual monastery, or hopefully several, right? That that people could go, because it is against my religion to evangelize to people, right? So I cannot take Christians, and like the fact that that's how I ended up talking to the nun about the monarchical trinity, and her response to me was, "What's the monarchical trinity?"
For alcoholics, see the thing is, and I know this, I used to deal with this.
Yeah.
Lots of my Christian friends or whatever, like the AA concepts were, so power greater than yourself, a higher power. You seek, you get, all those things are the wise paths. And so you have for the folks who are struggling with alcohol and drug addictions, AA's already solved that in spades, and you can be
God of your own.
You can be a Jew or a Christian, like people. It says to be quick to find where religious people are right.
Yeah.
Right. It tells you to seek those people out.
Right.
And it tells you to seek their prayers and so on and so forth. So the one thing that I love about what AA will do for people is, for if you are Jewish, well, get fully engaged in your Jewish faith. You know, get into the daily prayers.
And that's why I would want it to be near a monastery, because I cannot provide that for Gentiles.
Right. And so, but the people, what will happen is that, and I know this freaks other people out, that, you know, because I'm actually okay if I meet a man in AA and he's Jewish and he wants to go deeply into his Jewish practices within AA for his higher power. I have no problem with that.
No, and that's a beautiful thing. But at the same time, I think we, that's what the nun said. I need to talk to the abbess. But again, like, look, there's a property near the monastery. It's only like $2 million. If anybody wants to buy it from me, it's perfect. It's perfect. You want to make it happen? You make it happen. But
St. Anthony's down in Arizona is a very vibrant monastery too.
Look, but yeah, when it comes down to it, having a monastery nearby would be very, very useful. But my idea would be, it's a Noahide Beit Midrash, and it is against my religion to proselytize and encourage people into a particular religious tradition. So that's why I'm having this kind of thinking. Okay, we really should get back to this. But anybody who has $2 million, they want to spread. They want to whatchamacallit? We can make this happen.
Luke will cut you a check. He said that.
$2 million will make it happen like that. I'm telling you. Okay.
Oh, before we go in, apologize. Sam pointed this out. I confused Irenaeus and Ignatius from the John Bear conversations. It was Ignatius who wrote that, who was also a very early martyr of the church,
right?
Who was also around the same time of Irenaeus. So Sam from Transfigured was correct.
Okay. Okay. So schism with the West. I almost want to skip this stuff to get to the Jewish stuff because it's gonna. Yeah, I have to leave in half an hour. So you guys can read about the schism and the Filioque and Byzantium and ecumenism, because now we are going to move to the nice, the uncontroversial stuff. If you thought that this was spicy, okay. Non-Christian religions, bottom of page 176. Non-Christian religions are quite varied, so one must have varied approaches to them. Here we discuss Judaism, the various polytheistic faiths such as Hinduism and Islam. What all these faiths share in common is that the church calls them all to join in the same saving worship of the Trinity. Not going to happen. To accept a Christian baptism. Not as bad as the Trinity, but probably also not going to happen. And to live as a part of the church, that I actually don't think is I think that's actually going to happen, but that's when the church recognizes that we are the actual priesthood of God. Christianity regards contemporary Judaism as a true religion, and people lost their minds. And as worshiping the one true God, and people lost their minds, but considers it to be deficient, and this was not enough, since it stumbled at a step where it was called to mount up. I don't even understand what that word means. That is, and I still have not seen where Judaism has stumbled. So whatever. That is, Israel was called by God to accept Jesus of Nazareth. Citation needed. I'll take any citation you have. Give me any verse in the entirety of the Jewish Bible. And since I suspect that this video will be watched by many people who have not watched my channel, I will reiterate my actual challenge. I am very serious about this. And it's not my challenge because I'm not the one who first made it. Many rabbis have made this same challenge, but I will give $5,000 to anyone who can show me any prophecy of the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible that Jesus uniquely fulfilled. I am 100% honest about this. If you can show me any prophecy of the Messiah in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible that Jesus uniquely fulfilled, I will give you $5,000. I will definitely give you $5,000 because even though I am not a very rich man, I am rich in so many ways that $5,000 does not mean it is not worth more to me than knowing the truth of the Bible. It simply is not. So, as the Messiah, and to allow itself to be reconfigured as his church. Citation needed. Instead, most Jews in the 1st and 2nd centuries rejected Jesus as a deceiver. I don't know that they rejected Jesus as a deceiver. I kind of this is certainly what a lot of Jews later came to believe of Jesus. But even, I would say, a close reading of Maimonides is that's not so. Maimonides, the end of chapter 11 of the Laws of Kings and Wars was censored by the Catholic censors. Obviously, a lot of Jewish teachings have recently been uncensored because now in Israel people feel free not to have censored versions of the Talmud and Maimonides and other things. And so we've been able to now have a discussion, an open discussion about what exactly we do believe about Jesus, which we haven't been able to have for basically thousands of years. And so they bring up the Toldot Yeshu a while later in next paragraph. So what happened was that after Christianity became the official religion and the persecution of Jews started in earnest by Christianity, there were a series of forced debates, these famous disputations, and you can read accounts of these disputations, most famously Nachmanides, and the disputation of Barcelona was actually turned into a movie, and it's not a bad movie, actually. The disputation, and you can read his version of the disputation, you can read the Christian version of the disputation, which is kind of comical. But what happened was that part of these disputations ended up in things like trials of the Talmud and things like that. And therefore, any Jewish teaching about Jesus became suppressed. And so the official thing Jews said publicly about Jesus is we don't have any beliefs about Jesus, which created this basic understanding, certainly among Christians and even among Jews, that the proper Jewish understanding is Jesus is a horrible person. Now, I have in fact read the censored parts of the Talmud. Before you tell me I have not read the censored parts of the Talmud, yes, I have read the censored parts of the Talmud. And no, the censored parts of the Talmud don't say what you think they say. Because I actually know how to read Talmud, unlike the people who went through the Talmud and looked for any bad thing they could find, and to find ways of construing the Talmud as condemning Jesus. Like this actually, it's kind of like how Sam talks about the Gospel of John, in that Christians will go through and take a look at the things that the bad, evil Jews in the Gospel of John say about Jesus and be like, hey, that's right. And in a very similar manner, Christians went through the Talmud, found every bad thing they could figure out that it may be saying about Jesus, and said, that's what Jews believe about Jesus. Then they censored our Talmuds, and basically the Jewish belief became, well, I guess that's what the Talmud used to say. And even to this day, I don't know that most people used uncensored of the versions of the Talmud. Certainly, the Talmuds that are uncensored tend to have the uncensored texts in footnotes. So these are not widely studied segments of the Talmud at all. And there is not, unfortunately, I have to say, definitive Jewish teachings about Jesus which are publicly taught, because people are scared, and it's something we don't talk about. And then there's also the very real fear that if rabbis step in and start telling people, stop hating Jesus so much, that's not a Jewish thing to do, then people are going to think that's some sort of license to worship Jesus as God. And obviously, the worship of Jesus as God is a bad thing. That's not something that any rabbi wants to contribute in any way. So rabbis are very hesitant to say, no, that's not how you read the Talmud, especially for somebody who's suddenly really interested in knowing how to read the Talmud and what the Talmud says about Jesus. And so if you want to bring me a segment of the Talmud that you think I haven't seen yet, and you can come on my Just Chatting streams. I've had people constantly come and bring me the thing with the Onkelos and the bringing back the thing of Jesus and Jesus being boiled in excrement. Yes, I have read that one many, many times. I've gone through it all the way through, and the things about the Sanhedrin, and yes, I've read all of them. But we'll go through them again. That's not how you read Talmud. That's not how you define Jewish beliefs about something. And so I really dislike what this portrayal here. And so let's talk about Toldot Yeshu. Toldot Yeshu is obscene. Find yourself a copy if you can in English. I'll even go through it in, well, no, I actually wouldn't go through it in Hebrew because it is obscene. It is obscene. It is obscene. It is obviously obscene. It is not a Jewish religious text. Toldot Yeshu is obscene. Okay? It is a text that was very, very deliberately written by somebody out of pure hatred for Christians. And it's not anything that anybody ever went, hey, you know what? This is a book of my beliefs in Judaism. It is a book that is, I mean, it's not even a book. It's a pamphlet, and it's not a single pamphlet either. So because it was suppressed, it's this, it's almost like a comic book, you know? It's like this text that various people had that they were passing it around in secret, making fun of Jesus and Christianity. And like, it's the type of text you expect people who are being oppressed by Christians to make about Christianity. Okay? And so I am very, very unhappy with the people within Judaism who want us to somehow believe that our interpretation of how we should believe in Jesus is that which people who were reading the Talmud to try to find the worst interpretations believed. Like, these are not Talmudic scholars who are explaining how to understand the Talmud. These are Christians looking for proofs as to how Jews hate Jesus, and you're accepting their interpretations of the Talmud as actual beliefs of Judaism about Jesus. That doesn't work. the worst thing I have, I mean, there is what I believe is a Braita, which says Amar Mar, that that there was an anonymous teacher who taught that Jesus, when there's a whole story about how Jesus and was a student of a prominent teacher, and he there was a falling out because of a misunderstanding, and it's actually a critical story of the teacher of Jesus, that he failed to properly teach Jesus, and it ends with, and that's why Jesus became an idolater, right? It says that, and that's what it means when it says that Mar, some anonymous teacher, taught that Jesus became an idolater, right? And even that story, like that may be the most derogatory story in the entirety of the Talmud about Jesus. And even that story, actually, Jesus is the victim there. So, whatever. Okay. So, instead, most Jews in the 1st and 2nd centuries rejected Jesus as a deceiver and opposed the movement that he began, regarding it as heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous. Yeah, the movement that he began, and funny enough, that he gets capitalized. This drives me nuts. Regarding it as heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous, yeah, Christianity is heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous. And I will prove it from Christian sources. The vast majority of Christians, according to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the vast majority of Christians believe in a version of the Trinity, the Filioque, which makes them, according to Eastern Orthodox Christians, is heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous. So you tell me, as Eastern Orthodox Christians, whether the movement Jesus started, if you believe Jesus started the movement, is heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous, and then explain the Filioque to me. The Jewish people continued in this unfortunate trajectory for centuries afterward. Today, many religious Jews, for not all who define themselves as Jewish are religious, this is very true, entertain a more positive conception of Jesus. Okay, regarding him as a good Jew, whom his followers misunderstood and deified in a way that he never intended. Capital H again. The older, more classic, and more negative assessment of Jesus may be found in the Talmud. I disagree with that. And in the polemic recounting of his life, the Toldot Yeshu, I find the, in any way, equating the Talmud with Toldot Yeshu offensive. I really do. The two are in no way like you might as well talk about the church fathers and I don't know what those the church fathers and the Greek comedies, Sophocles or whatever, right? Completely different things. Please do not, like, I even mentioning Toldot Yeshu, we'll talk about it as much as you want. The only reason I have not gone through it on my channel is it's obviously obscene. And the reason most people won't read it is it's obviously obscene. It is an obscenity. So don't compare that to the Talmud, please. It was this older anti-Christian Judaism that the church fathers knew and reacted against. Okay, some Gentiles unfortunately misunderstood the Jewish, and I have to say the Toldot Yeshu is 1,000 years after the Talmud, right? You're comparing something like the Toldot Yeshu, I think the oldest versions may be around I don't even know when maybe 9th century, maybe. I don't even, I think the versions we have are from the 14th century. There's 1,000 years between the even the Babylonian Talmud, forget about the Jerusalem Talmud, right? Which is the older Talmud. So this story, I don't like this story. Some Gentiles unfortunately misunderstood the Jewish roots of the Christian faith and used a false version of Christianity to justify severe anti-Semitism. Some Christians, vast majority of Christians, Christianity has spent 2,000 years doing things that now most Christians are ashamed of. So again, let me ask you, whether or not it's true that the movement that Jesus began is heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous. And unless you're a Catholic, you believe that the majority of Christians believe in a faith that is heretical, dangerous, and blasphemous. So, this isn't the Jewish view, this is the Christian view. Some Gentiles unfortunately misunderstand the Jewish roots of terrible atrocities were then committed, sometimes even in the name of Christ, sometimes. And one thing I did tell Father Stephen is I think it is wrong to say that the Holocaust or Shoah was done in the name of Christ. It was not. It was done at best in the name of positive Christianity, and positive Christianity is an abomination that certainly the Catholic Church and the Confessing Church with the Barmen Declaration stood against. And so to call the Holocaust something that was done in the name of Christ is wrong. It was far more done in the name of Darwinism and secularism and atheism. And so while the church has many sins to its name, confessing the sins of the fascists, communists, and atheists in the name of Christians, I think is to add insult to injury. Such anti-Semitism is immoral, sinful, and wrong. Thank you. And has no place in any church that claims to follow Christ. But because Christians believe that God called Israel to accept Jesus as the Messiah, citation needed, the church continues to urge the Jewish people to convert to Christ, thereby fulfilling their ancient ancestral destiny. Some Jewish people who have converted to Christ refer to themselves not as converted Jews, but as completed Jews. I am not aware that this is something that is done outside of certain Protestant circles, and frankly, I find that a bit. Just call yourself a Christian. You have attached yourself to a community that is not our community. There is a reason why people like Isaac Lichtenstein and Franz Rosenzweig and like Geza Vermes, who all considered themselves disciples of Jesus, all three of them ended up in the Jewish community as opposed to the Christian community. I would say that's probably true of James Tabor and many, many Noahides today. And what I would like to see is a Jewish community that is willing to accept, and this is not from me, Rabbi Skobach, who is the one of probably the most prominent rabbi from Jews for Judaism, and an expert in counter-missionary efforts by the Orthodox Jewish community, says, and I agree with him, that we as Orthodox Jews need to prepare to deal with the question that Gamliel in Acts 5 seemed to, in fact, be dealing with, where we had actual Jews who were not in any way blasphemous, who were not in any way rejecting the Torah, or the zealous Jews for the law that James describes in Acts 21. We need to be prepared as Orthodox Jews to allow such people who believe that Jesus will be the Messiah, or who are simply grateful to Jesus for having brought them to Torah and observance of Torah. And I would say certainly Noahides who have that view. We need to, in fact, be welcoming such people, as long as we are doing it by the standards of halacha, of Jewish law. We need to, in fact, allow and welcome these people back into our synagogues, back into our communities, because our standard must be what halacha requires, not what a bunch of anti-Semites believe that Judaism believes. And our beliefs in the Torah of God are not, cannot, should not, must not be defined by a rejection of what other people had to say, and fear of where people may misunderstand us. And especially in this time of parrhesia, as and this may be the most important single concept that Judaism and Christianity have in common, is Parrhesia. It is actually a Greek word that has found itself in halacha, in Jewish law, and the three most recent popes have all spoken about it as an important concept for Christians. And I have been, since my very first discussion with Paul Vanderklay, have been talking about the importance of this concept of parrhesia, and Michel Foucault also has been talking about it, and he may have the best exposition of it that's been done in recently. But in the interests of parrhesia, in the fact that we live in a time of parrhesia, we need to, in fact, be willing to speak boldly. Okay, and since it's 4:00, I do have to go, and I will probably have a discussion about this sometime later, but talk to you guys later.